Sehr geehrter Herr Ständeratspräsident, sehr geehrte Mitglieder des Ständerates, sehr geehrte Nationalräte, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. I would also like to warmly welcome the viewers on the live stream. My name is Ernst Fehr and I am the director of the UBS Center for Economics in Society at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. Today is a very special occasion, one that brings together history, progress, and intellectual curiosity. It is a story that began nearly 12 years ago, in 2012, when the UBS Center for Economics in Society was founded with the vision of fostering world-class economic research with societal relevance, and the aim to distribute new, important knowledge via a public dialogue between academia, the business world, and the political world. As part of this vision, we established the annual Forum for Economic Dialogue, a big event with several hundred people, and the highlight of this event is always the Zurich Lecture for Economics in Society. And we usually recruit people for the Zurich Lecture for Economics in Society, or not usually, always, which is given by an economist whom we judge to be the most interesting based on path-breaking research. That same year, 2012, we had invited Professor Daron Acemoğlu to give the first Zurich Lecture for Economics in Society. Back then, his groundbreaking work on institutions and economic development had already shaped the global discourse. His book, Why Nations Fail, had just been published, offering profound insights into how political and economic institutions shape the fate of nations. His lecture in Zurich left a lasting impression on our academic community and beyond. Tonight, 12 years later, he returns, not just as an esteemed economist, but as a Nobel laureate. This is no coincidence. It is a testament to his enduring influence and the huge relevance of his work. I think it's probably fair to say that he is among the 2 to 3 most important and most impactful economists of our time. His connection to our department, also at the University of Zurich, runs pretty deep. Our current department chairman, Professor Florian Scheuer, completed his PhD under Daron's supervision. And UBS Foundation Professor David Hemus has collaborated with him on influential research on extremely important questions such as how can we direct technological progress such that it contributes to mitigating climate change. And I had the privilege of knowing Daron personally for at least 2 decades when I was for about 10 years during my time as an affiliated faculty member at the Department of Economics at MIT, his colleague. Daron is not just a brilliant scholar. He's a thinker who challenges our assumptions about power, institutions, and progress. He is the Institute Professor at MIT, a title reserved for the most distinguished minds. And his academic contributions span countless articles and books. His latest work, Power and Progress, co-authored with Simon Johnson, invites us to critically examine a question that has shaped societies for centuries. Does technological advancement automatically lead to a better world? History tells us that progress is not a straight line. From the Industrial Revolution to the digital age, technology has transformed our lives, but its benefits have not always been evenly distributed, sometimes very unevenly. Daron argues that progress is shaped also by power relationships, by those who control and direct the innovation. This book is not just an analysis of past transformations. It is a call to shape the future and to ensure the gains of technological benefit for the many and not just the few. Now, before we start, I want to give you some technical information. During the presentation, you can already submit your questions online. So I have an iPad afterwards, and I can see the questions arriving. You can also vote on the questions. You can. I won't guarantee that I take the most popular ones, but I will be guided by that. So take your mobile phone or open a new tab in your browser and go to menti.com and dial in with the code 2603-7554, or just use this symbol here. On this platform, you can ask questions for our live Q&A afterwards, at the end of the session. And even if you don't have any questions, as I told you, you can still vote on them. We are very fortunate to have Daron with us today to share these insights. And actually, we were very glad that we invited him before we knew that he got the Nobel Prize. Who knows what would have happened due to his full time schedule, whether he would have had the time to come. But he was already committed, and he is known to live up to his commitments. Thank you, Daron. Without further ado, I hand over to the 2024 Nobel Prize laureate in economics, Professor Daron Acemoğlu. Daron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much, Ernst, and thank you to all of you for being here. It's my distinct pleasure to be back at Zurich, which I have visited many times before. It's a fantastic economics department, and I'm really happy to have been the inaugural lecturer, speaker at the inception of UBS Center, and I am very happy to be back. And I'm going to talk to you about exactly what Ernst mentioned, the relationship between technological progress and shared prosperity. By shared prosperity, I mean economic growth from which all demographic groups broadly benefit. No group of people are completely left behind. And I'll be more specific about these definitions and issues as I go along. But as background, there is no doubt that we live in an age of innovation. Even before the advances in generative AI that have captured all imaginations so widely throughout the world, we have become accustomed to changing all of our gadgets every year, or new apps appearing on our telephones, new programs for our computers, all sorts of new utilities and services, and the data available from many sources support that. So for example, in the United States, the number of patents filed at the USPTO have quadrupled since 1980, and a large, very large fraction, almost all of this increase have been driven by two sectors, electronics and electrical machinery, and information technology and communication sectors. So these are not just important sectors by in and of themselves, but they are big enablers of other industries to use information, to use knowledge, and change their production processes in a potentially very positive way. Now, the next step of that is artificial intelligence, which many view as a completely transformative technology, and expectations are running high in terms of how boundless the productivity gains and all the benefits from technology will be. But I think even if some of these optimistic forecasts at the aggregate level are realized, the question of who will benefit from them is an important one. It's an important one because we don't care about GDP, we care about our standards of living, our general social, economic, and psychological well-being. And if GDP just increases and a small fraction of people get all of the benefits, that's not going to be as optimistic a picture. Moreover, as I'm going to argue, who controls technology? Who shapes its direction? Who decides key decisions in the economic and social realm have far-ranging implications. And in fact, my contention in doing some of the research and writing the book from which I'm drawing Power and Progress, which Ernst also mentioned, is that these questions are not being sufficiently asked. Now, there is an optimistic take which would justify not asking these questions. It would go along the following lines. It would say, well, with such a revolutionary technology that will bring so widespread gains, you don't need to worry about who decides, who controls, and so on. Either automatically everybody will benefit because these changes are so widespread, and or there are very powerful economic mechanisms that ensure that gains are broadly shared. And what that means in particular is that somehow they are reflected to wages. Because most of us earn our living in the labor market by selling our skills, talents, expertise, and if wages don't increase, that's not going to be a very likely basis for shared prosperity. So here, the economist's take is actually quite optimistic. In most of the economic approaches that we have developed over the last several decades, there is a set of powerful forces which ensure that gains are broadly shared. And Simon Johnson and I refer to these as the productivity bandwagon. Even though they are so common in economic models, they didn't have a name, so we had to invent a name. So productivity bandwagon seemed like a good one. So the productivity bandwagon goes something like this. Technology improves, so we have better knowledge, better scientific or practical knowledge to do better things. That gets applied to the production process. Now, it may get applied to doing different things, like building nuclear weapons, and let's leave those aside, okay? So it does get applied to the production process, and there is no doubt that artificial intelligence at some point will be massively applied to the production process. Since these technologies are actually better, they will increase productivity. What that means, they will increase how much the economy produces per worker, for example. That's what we would call average productivity. And then there will be a natural set of forces that will generate benefits for workers. So the idea here is that somehow if productivity is higher in terms of firms producing more, they will want to hire more workers because each worker now corresponds to more output. And that process, via some sort of competitive forces, will lead to higher wages. That is the essence of the productivity bandwagon. Now notice there are two assumptions here which often don't get spelled out. One is that higher average productivity, more output per firm, per worker, sorry, will make firms want to hire more workers. Well, that's not immediate. I'll come back to that. The second is that somehow if firms want to hire more workers, that will lead to higher wages. Well, that's also not immediate. That depends on institutions. That depends on power. It depends on whether labor markets are competitive or there are other processes via which gains are shared. If you look at history, okay, fine, history is different to today. We live in the present. But if you look at history, there are plenty of examples of reasonably transformative technologies that have not translated into gains for workers. On the left, I have one of many medieval technologies that increased agricultural productivity massively. Windmills were really revolutionary, but there's no evidence that they led to higher wages for higher incomes for peasants who remained at subsistence. Why not? Well, anybody who comments on that will put a lot of emphasis on the fact that the situation was very different from a competitive labor market. Many workers were under onerous obligations, so even if their productivity was higher, there was no natural mechanism for them to do so. On the right, there is another transformative, really absolutely revolutionary technology, the cotton gin. The US South, which was a complete economic backwater in the middle of the 18th century, became the largest exporter of cotton in the world and fueled the British Industrial Revolution, which first started in textiles. How did they do that? Well, thanks to that gadget. That gadget enabled the southern cotton to be cleaned, and the South suddenly became one of the most dynamic parts of the world in terms of production and value. But the people who actually produced the cotton, which were slaves, gain none of the benefit, and most of the estimates suggest that their conditions and welfare significantly decreased as they were moved to deep down south. They had to work longer hours, and the question is again quite clear, that was about power. They were enslaved, hence they didn't have much of a say about whether they would work in Virginia or in Mississippi, and how their days would be organized. Now, when people talk about an optimistic interpretation of the digital age, or the period that will be ushered by the artificial intelligence revolution, they say, well, you don't have much to worry about because we know from history that new technologies can be disruptive, but things work out. Well, I think what they are referring to is the Industrial Revolution, which of course we are greatly, all should be anyway, grateful to people who made all these innovations and started the application of the scientific process to production, because we are much, much more comfortable, much, much healthier, much, much more prosperous than people who lived, say, in the 1750s, before the Industrial Revolution started. But if you look into the details of the Industrial Revolution, things weren't so smoothly following an arc towards improvement. The early phases of the Industrial Revolution were, first of all, very harsh. People were dislocated from their lands. They worked under very, very harsh conditions in mines, in factories, very long hours. But also, economically, the major force of the early Industrial Revolution was automation, the application of new machinery for tasks previously done by workers. For example, spinners first, then weavers, and all of that was not just disruptive in the Silicon Valley positive sense of disruption, but really led to people being kicked out from their work or losing a lot of their income. So some estimates suggest that real income of weavers, which were before the automation started relatively well paid, may have declined by 2/3 in the course of about 2 decades, and certainly their working conditions worsened, their hours lengthened. The automation question is so important because it really questions the first channel that I mentioned, that productivity increases, and that productivity increase translates into greater demand for workers. And to understand the issues without getting into the techniques, it's useful to recall an oft-told story. It's humorous, and you'll see the humorous part, whether it appeals to you or not, but it is often said that the future factory will have 2 employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure the man doesn't touch the equipment. So now that's some people's utopia, some people's dystopia, but what's humorous about it is, of course, that the man is completely unnecessary. So that is an extreme form that we have great machinery. The machinery increases output per worker. Okay, you can count the dog if you want, but output per 2 or 1 worker is very, very high, but the worker is not necessary. So the marginal product of the worker, meaning what he contributes to output, is very small. No company is going to rush to to hire many men and dogs, or will they pay them much? So that is a wedge between average productivity and marginal productivity. Automation is so important because it potentially threatens that big channel that goes from improvements in productivity, output increasing, us producing new goods and services, more goods and services, and that translating into shared prosperity potentially. Now, all of this, you might say, even this is history. The digital age is different. We live in more enlightened times. You know, you wouldn't have people forcing children as young as 5 into mines to work there for 18 hours. Yes, we are more enlightened. But there are also some strange parallels between old times and new times. So here I'm showing you the real hourly wages of workers in the United States by 10 demographic groups. On the left, men, on the right, women. Each one of these lines corresponds to an education group, all the way from the bottom for workers without a high school degree, all the way to the top in dark blue to workers who have a postgraduate degree. The 1950s, early 60s, which I'm not showing you here because they have to come from a different data source, but which cannot be made completely consistent with this. But the 1950s, early 1960s, mid-1960s, 1970s that you're seeing here are consistent with my definition of shared prosperity. Look at these curves. They are following each other. In fact, in the 50s, the lower education groups were experiencing faster wage growth than higher education groups. Here, among women, they are experiencing the same. Among men, postgraduates are already doing a little bit better than the rest. But you have this general pattern of a rising tide lifting all boats. And then fast forward to 1980, you see a completely different pattern, a sea change. What's going on is that postgraduates and women with some college education are experiencing relatively rapid wage growth, but other groups have stopped taking part in shared prosperity. In fact, for men and some women groups, there is a decline in real earnings that goes all the way to the mid-2010s. So there are more than a 3-decade period during which the real wages of low education workers is actually declining rather than increasing. Now, something like this has many causes, and even though we talk of general increase in inequality in the industrialized world, reality is very different, emphasizing that institutions matter. So for example, if you look at Sweden, data that other people have processed implies that wage inequality hasn't increased that much. That's the blue line here on top. But overall inequality increases because of hours changes and capital income changes. So overall, on the right-hand side, the picture shows inequality is very, very variable across countries, across the industrialized world. In some countries, inequality increases a lot. In some countries, it increases a little. In some countries, it increases because of labor income inequality. In some countries, it increases because of hours inequality. In some countries, it increases because of capital income inequality. So all of these have to be borne in mind. They already suggest that we are not completely passive agents when it comes to what's going on to shared prosperity, that technology fully determines everything. Institutions, organizations, and other things like that matter. And in fact, that is also relevant when you want to understand how is it that in the past, shared prosperity has emerged. And there are many places where you can look. For example, we could look in the British Industrial Revolution after 1850, a similar picture emerges. But since I have spoken about the US so far, let me give an example from the US. The seeds of what I showed you in terms of relatively rapid wage growth for all groups of workers in the post-war era were already there in the first half of the 20th century. And the automobile industry plays a very important role, symbolic, but actually an important role. And really, you can see two major forces that are at the root of that shared technology, shared prosperity experience. And they relate to the two preconditions that I mentioned. One is that technology should be such that increases in average productivity also increase the contribution of workers to the production process so that firms have an incentive and a desire to pay more to workers. And the organization of the market has to be such that it is credible and actually feasible for workers to get that share. The auto industry gives various pathways for this. On the upper part, what I'm showing you is a picture from one of the revolutionary plants that Henry Ford opened, the electrified Rouge plant in Michigan. And this was completely a transformative example of how you could use new electrical machinery to reorganize the production line. And you see already that the way that you produce cars here is completely different from what it came before. But the other thing that you see is that it's not like electrical machinery is doing the work. There are all these workers around the cars, and they are doing critical functions. What the Ford factories became known as they became known as engineering plants, because what they were doing is that they were pushing the level of production of technical tasks to the next level. And the workers that previously were busy trying to make parts fit were now doing much more technical operations and operating much more sophisticated machinery that was doing things that were unimaginable before, but also a whole cadre of people that you didn't see in the back offices were doing inspection, design, accounting, and all sorts of other support tasks that were very important for the mass production. During the same period, employment increased several folds in the course of 2 decades because the car industry was so dynamic. So that is what I have called in my work with Pascual Restrepo, for example, new tasks. Automation wasn't the only thing that technology was doing, but technology was also creating new tasks out of which labor benefited. And at the bottom right, you see the other pillar, which was that the auto industry was also at the forefront of workers organizing so that they made sure via bargaining that some of the gains were actually shared. So if you look at the modern period where you see this huge inequality in the United States, the source of it, I would argue, is that both of these pillars got weaker. On the technology side, a lot of the emphasis went into automation. So now you see another factory for producing cars and another set of very impressive technologies. But what's absent is the set of workers who were doing the critical tasks. You see only one person. I don't know whether he's a worker or not, but he doesn't seem like a manual worker. He's most probably an engineer or something. So, and a lot of the inequality that I showed you is about manual workers and other low education workers losing their jobs. But also, at the same time, this is not just an auto industry phenomenon. I'm emphasizing this because I think for a long time, economists have underappreciated the role that automation played in understanding wage slowdown, wage inequality, and so on. And here in this figure, drawn from some other work that I have done with Pascual Restrepo, I show that a lot of the inequality of our time in the United States can be understood as being related to how we are using machinery and how we are automating. To do that, what I'm doing is I am now looking at more disaggregated demographic groups, not just by gender and education, but gender, education, ethnicity, and age. So each one of these dots is a different group that differs by age or education, etc. You can see the education from the color. On the vertical axis, instead of looking at the time series, now I am zeroing into that critical period from 1980 to 2015. Now you see that the zero line, and indeed about half of the dots, half of the points are below the zero line, which means that about half of the demographic groups and half of the population have benefited very little or none at all from the technological changes and the economic growth of the post-1980 era. But most interestingly, on the horizontal axis, I have our measure of automation, which roughly is what fraction of tasks that a demographic group used to perform in 1980 that have since been automated. And you see a very strong relationship, which indicates to me that unless we understand automation and how we have used technology, we won't be able to understand what has gone with wages and inequality and collapse of shared prosperity in the United States. But it's not only technology. Technology itself is endogenous. It's decided by firms. It's decided by technologies. And the other pillar of how the gains are shared is also very important. During the same period, we have seen a huge gap open between, for example, what the CEOs are paid and what manual workers are paid. That is about technology, but it's also about bargaining. It's also about organizations and institutions. So in that respect, the other pillar of shared prosperity collapsed, and it collapsed both for reasons related to ideology, idea, or vision, meaning a different sort of ideas became very popular among business leaders and political leaders. You cannot blame anything on a single person, but it would be fair to identify some of these ideas with Milton Friedman, the very bright, very influential, and very revolutionary economist who has made many important contributions to economics, but his most famous contribution is something he wrote in the New York Times magazine, where he argued the only social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, in particular, which means that if you are a manager and you can cut wages, that's great, you're doing the right thing. So that sort of vision started becoming very popular among business leaders, sometimes propagated by business schools, sometimes propagated by management consulting companies. And the resistance to it came to some degree from unions, but from around, the unions were in decline already in the late 60s and 70s, but they became much more weakened in the 1980s, especially after Reagan fired all the striking professional traffic controllers, and there was a setup where other businesses also followed Reagan's lead. But I think all of this also played together with another important set of ideas that steered technology and how technology was used. And that came from the computer sector or the technology sector. The 1980s were the age of computers and digital technologies, and all of the automation technologies that I put on the horizontal axis of my figure 2 slides ago were about digital technologies. So what determined the direction of digital technologies? Of course, whatever is more profitable is more likely to be produced, but also ideas matter. And in particular, and this is relevant for AI, the direction of travel for digital technologies was very much influenced by this brilliant mathematician, Alan Turing, who not just broke completely revolutionary mathematical ground, but also started the field of computer science, both with technical but also philosophical contributions. And his philosophical ideas emphasize how machines can be considered to think like humans, and arguing about autonomous machine intelligence, meaning machine intelligence, machines doing things like humans, and autonomous, meaning that this could be done in a self-acting way. This was originally resisted by many philosophers and mathematicians, but it became the founding ideology of another group of very influential people shown here, which were the founders of the field of artificial intelligence in a conference in Dartmouth in 1956, where the field was christened with great fanfare and promises of human-level cognition arriving in less than 12 months or perhaps in 18 months. Okay, fine, that did not realize, but the influence of this perspective has shaped a lot of computer science and a lot of how we have used digital technologies, especially when coupled with pretty decent meaning effective models of monetization, meaning that companies like Microsoft, before then IBM, and then later others, were able to monetize digital technologies by selling services and automation tools and so on. Now, so far so good. If these technologies increase productivity, perhaps even if they are creating this wedge between productivity and what firms are willing to pay for labor, there could be some saving grace. Well, the funny thing is that the age of innovation has not been an age of productivity growth. So the most common measure that economists use for productivity is total factor productivity, meaning how much output increases, GDP increases once we take out the contribution of investment in machinery and labor becoming more, working more or becoming more educated. So it's the residual due to efficiency and technological prowess and things like that. In the United States and in Europe, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you had very, very rapid total factor productivity growth, sometimes as high as 3%, often between 1.5% and 2%, which means a complete sort of gift of the economy becoming more effective, richer, more efficient. But during the digital age, we have hardly exceeded 0.5% on average. So somehow, and on the right, I'm showing you Europe, but let me not spend more time on that. Somehow we're not getting the dividends out of technology. Why aren't we getting the dividends? Well, one possibility is because we're mismeasuring it, but I think part of it is that we are not actually using technology the best way. The best way of using technology is making workers more productive. That's what Ford did. Ford wasn't a lover of workers. In fact, he was as anti-union as you can get, and he was a pretty difficult boss to live with. But he thought that the only way that he could make money and he could create mass market for cars was by making workers more productive. That's why he introduced all these new tasks. That's why he actually provided much more greater responsibility for workers in the production process. Instead, what we have done a lot is, with exceptions, there are some revolutionary uses of robotics and some very important uses of software, obviously, but in many fields, in many industries, the evidence suggests that just like self-checkout kiosks, we have done what I've called so-so automation, meaning, yeah, you automate things, it reduces costs a little bit, it increases profits a little bit, but it's hardly revolutionary. It's hardly the kind of thing that will lead to a very, very rapid productivity growth, and that's partly the reason why in this innovation age, productivity growth has been so dismal. But this is only part of the story. If I had another hour, I would talk about how we can misuse technology in other things, which is, for example, in our social relations, in the balance between state and state institutions and people. We have experienced a much deeper penetration of all sorts of surveillance into our lives, sometimes coming from the Chinese Communist Party, like in the social credit system, where you have to get your social credit checked before you can buy a train ticket, or for social media companies, which can have enough information to know exactly your preferences of what you're doing. So the digital age is also the age of control of information, and AI is going to intensify that. All of that means, in my mind, that we should question who controls technology and the direction in which we are developing technology, especially AI. And what's wrong with this picture is that even when they weren't on such bad terms, when Sam Altman and Elon Musk are sitting in a room and deciding the direction of AI, that is an impoverished discussion because it leaves out the remaining 8 billion people. So if 8 billion people's fates are going to be decided by AI, then they should have some input into it, including workers, including civil society, including people outside of the United States. The way that sort of things were not perfect but happened before was through organization, through countervailing powers, the labor movement, the bottom-up organization of society. Before he was demonized as the spoiler of the 2000 election, Ralph Nader was known as the organizer of the civil society movement that led to a lot of the safety regulations that were quite important in the early stages of the post-war era. And of course, not excessive, but appropriate regulation is a very important part of that. Now, throughout the the digital age, we've had many thinkers and some activists who have articulated different aspirations for technologies. There were a group of people in the 1970s, before then there were a group of people in the 1960s, before then there were a group of people in the 1950s, who all thought that technology that was going to be embedded in code, digital technology, and then PCs were going to be liberating. They were going to make people more powerful, more productive, more informed, and they were worried that the only barrier to that kind of shared prosperity was that companies like IBM would control the technology. So Ted Nelson, for example, was one of them, and he thought that computer power would go to the people as long as what he called the cyber crud. They often meant the IBM. They had no idea what was coming next. Would be the only barrier on top of it. But this wasn't just a sort of a unrealistically optimistic Pollyanna-ish view. Better AI in the form of making workers more productive is actually quite feasible, and we have both the technical understanding to see that that's quite a doable thing, and we have history to show it. And machine intelligence, autonomous machine intelligence that's become so second nature to everybody in the tech industry wasn't in fact the only vision that led to digital technologies. In the same year that Alan Turing was writing about how the imitation game and how machines can think like humans, Norbert Wiener, who was a mathematician and engineer at MIT, was talking about why robots would be in their form not good for shared prosperity and how we could create better technologies. Those ideas are what Simon Johnson and I call machine usefulness, to contrast with machine intelligence. And again, I want to emphasize that's not just an aspiration, but it's also a reality. If you think of some of the most important digital technology innovations, they actually came out of that vision. On the right here, I have the first mouse. It was revealed by Douglas Engelbart, who was a very, very talented engineer, but also he not only was an engineer, I don't think he knew exactly what Norbert Wiener was talking about, but he had rediscovered the same ideas, and he called them human-computer complementarity. And there actually is a field within computer science which is essentially about his ideas. He revealed that in an event he called the mother of all demos. And the other things that were revealed there that he showed to as prototypes: hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers. So a lot of the things that we take as granted actually came out of this vision of enabling people, workers, citizens, to be more powerful. That person on the left is J.C.R. Licklider. He was another one of these thinker philosophers. An article he wrote 60 years ago, which is called Human-Machine Symbiosis, was all about how we can use computers to expand human capabilities because humans are going to have better information. Again, he wasn't just talking, he also designed the ARPANET protocols. So the first, if there's any father or grandfather of the internet, it's J.C.R. Licklider. But the irony is that when J.C.R. Licklider was writing more than 60 years ago about human minds being amplified by computers, that was completely impossible. That was just completely impossible. But today it's possible. Today we have already in the internet all the information that you want and a lot of information that you don't want. But the problem is, if you need useful information, meaning information at some point that is going to be useful for you to write an article, to become a better electrician, to troubleshoot something that's going wrong at home, you cannot find that. What generative AI actually does is that it has that capability to provide the filter to achieve that information, to reach that information, relevant information for you given your needs in real time and in a reliable fashion. But the current architecture and the current direction of automation and monetizing things via digital advertisement will not go there. What will go there? Well, we don't know, we haven't tried, but obviously if we redirect technological change, just like what Ted Nelson was saying at the time, there is a much better chance. Now, I don't know how to redirect technological change. We have from history examples of things that may have worked in terms of certain policies, certain regulations, market structure, certain democratically generated policies regulations that may have had that effect. But I want to end by saying, even if we don't know exactly how to do that, the hope that we could do it is not crazy. Sometimes people say the government has no ability to lead innovation. Well, if you interpret the government has no ability, if you interpret that by saying if the government has no ability to be the innovator itself, that's right. But the fact that innovation is an organic bottom-up process doesn't mean that incentives, leadership, subsidies, financing don't have an influence. And one place where you can see that already is in the energy sector. Even though I think the damage that fossil fuels would do in terms of global warming were generally well understood in the 1980s, 1990s, there wasn't much that you could do. All of that talk of the 1980s and 1990s of reducing fossil fuel emissions was just talk. Because the only way you could reduce fossil fuel emission in the 1980s and 1990s was by reducing energy consumption, and no country was going to put up with that. As late as 2000, still none of the renewable energies, low emission energies, were even anywhere near competitive with fossil fuels. But today, thanks to innovation, which itself was based on some amount of subsidies, a little bit of carbon tax around the world, and some sort of greater awareness of and demand from the population to have cleaner energy, there has been a tremendous amount of innovation, learning by doing, cost reductions in solar panels and other technologies. And if you want to produce electricity today, and if you can deal with intermittency issues, it's much cheaper to do it via solar or wind than fossil fuels. So that was an example of redirecting technological change, and I think we should remain open. In fact, we should remain insistent that similar redirection is feasible, and perhaps it should be part of the democratic conversation about what direction of AI should be. Thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Daron,
Thank you, Ernst.
for this interesting and inspiring presentation. I will now take a few questions from menti.com. And one question that was asked several times was, historically, Europe was a tech leader. Now we are lagging behind China and the US. Why is that? Is it due to regulation? Is it due to industrial policy? To other factors? What is your view on that?
Well, I think I am generally aligned with the Draghi report, that is a very, very major problem. But it is largely a tech problem. If you look into other sectors, Europe is not falling behind that much. Europe was ahead of the US in 5G and telecommunication sector. In aerospace, Europe is not so clearly behind. In banking, European banks, in terms of technology adoption, haven't been behind the US. There are other parts of the banking sector due to the financial crisis, but that's a different issue, not a technology issue. In terms of many services, Europe is not behind. It was at some point behind, but it has caught up. But in technology, anything to do with tech, Europe is behind. And I think part of that is because of regulation. Part of it is because Europe did not create the right ecosystem for financing these technologies, and it did not create a hub. So one thing we have seen, and I don't think anybody knew or understood this, is that, tech seems to be very concentrated. So I'll tell you one other area that's really behind in tech. It's Route 128. Route 128 is where a lot of the early tech companies were outside of Boston. And if you went to the US in the 1980s and you said, where is the tech capital, they might have pointed out to Route 128. But Route 128 never built the sort of dynamic concentration which then went to Silicon Valley, and that's where it took off. So I think that's what Europe never attempted or could have achieved, and that's part of the problem with the associated financing. But it's not a trivial problem, because if the US economy today is doing so well in terms of comparison to Europe, a lot of it is about tech, but it's also a dangerous problem, because that means that with all of the issues that I've talked about, the direction of tech is what the direction of a few powerful companies and a few powerful executives are setting in Silicon Valley. Greater plurality would be great. So European tech industry that's dynamic and goes in its own direction would be fantastic. How to get there, again, the details are more challenging than the aspiration.
So one other question that came up here is that from a Swiss audience, that why is trickle-down economics working so well in Switzerland but not in other countries? So we had much less increase in inequality. So what are the factors to which that you see behind this development?
Well, I don't know about the Swiss economy enough to be able to answer that question, but my question to you would be, Ernst, since you would know better, is whether that is trickle-down economics. By trickle-down economics, I think we mean, or at least many people mean, enrich the very rich, and it will trickle down from them. And I think my understanding of the institutional setup in Switzerland is not exactly that, but perhaps it is. I don't know.
No, it's actually not. I mean, we have already, before the state redistributes, a much more egalitarian income distribution in Switzerland to some educational institutions, perhaps, and a dual education system and so on. So that is maybe an important factor here. A final question before I open up for the audience is, are tech giants a threat for society?
Well, I think you have to decide that for yourself. I think so. But everybody will have their own decision on that. You know, my cause for concern is not very original. It's what Lord Acton said almost 200 years ago: power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If any person, organization, institution becomes too powerful, whether it is the unions, whether it is progressive groups, whether it is far-right people, whether it's a politician, whether it's a king, whether it's a company, if they become too powerful without any countervailing powers, that is dangerous. And the tech companies, in my opinion, and again, some more right-leaning people and argue, you know, magazines like The Economist would vehemently disagree, they have unparalleled powers. Well, I'll give you one statistic. Just before it was broken up, compute Standard Oil's value and convert it to today's currency. It's 1/100th the value of each one of Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Apple. So these are 100 times economically more powerful than Standard Oil. And I think socially, meaning in terms of their influence over our lives, they're even more powerful than that. That is huge. And if we are grappling with a transformative technology like AI, whose direction is going to determine whether we have a democracy, whether there is shared prosperity, the same companies deciding that future is a bit alarming to me. But I think The Economist magazine thinks it's just fine, so you can take your pick.
Well, there's one interesting question that came up through recent events. How do you comment on the DeepSeek story? So this new revolutionary technology that came up just a few days ago, at least publicly known.
Well, I actually think I'm excited about DeepSeek because for a couple of reasons. First of all, you know, one of the arguments that I heard a number of times when I talk about these things is, who are you to criticize the tech industry? They're investing so much and they have the best talent. They obviously know what works best. Well, DeepSeek shows that was completely wrong. That with 1/100th the budget of OpenAI, they have achieved something quite similar to what OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. are doing. So that actually is very much consistent with my interpretation that these tech companies are just following one singular idea. It's actually remarkable that a lot of people have said things that sound a little bit like this, but essentially there are so many different ways in which you can develop AI. And the foundation models based on next word prediction just is one strategy, and it's the one that overwhelming amount of investment went into. What DeepSeek did is it's actually something much more reasonable. If you think about it, for example, as an econometrician, you would think, well, if you're trying, or a statistician, you would think, well, if you're trying to do something, you want to have some sort of objective function that you maximize, you optimize. That's what, you know, a lot of machine learning used to be before generative AI came on the scene. But with generative AI, they abandoned that for these self-trained, pre-trained models. Well, what DeepSeek did is it went back to that. They specified some objective function. We don't know what it is. And they tried to optimize that with reinforcement learning, which is a very common method for doing that. And it shows a lot of success. So I think it indicates to me, but again, I'm looking at it from my point of view, that there are many different approaches to this. So if we are willing to finance new competitors, new approaches for using AI in different directions, there is legs for that.
Okay, so let's open for the general public. There is a question over there.
My question relates to the situation that we'll have in 20, 30 years, the peak of human population on this planet. How do the changing demographics and the rapid shrinking of the population, we see it already in China, in South Korea, affect your views of shared prosperity?
There is no doubt in my mind that an aging population and ultimately later a declining population are going to generate both social and economic challenges. But I don't see that as an existential threat. If you look at the data, surprisingly, and it goes against most economic theories, over the last 40 years, aging societies have not grown any slower. In fact, they may have grown a little bit faster. So adaptation to aging has been possible in countries like South Korea, Japan, Germany, France. And it's been possible via a variety of changes in the industrial structure. It's been possible via changes in technology. So I think we'll manage the aging process, but it is important that we are aware of it. There are obvious mistakes that some countries are making, and those are going to have a much harder time. So one of the very rapidly aging societies, for example, of the next 30 years is going to be Turkey, and which was a very young population, and it's going to age very, very rapidly. And right now, the last 5 years, they have passed legislation that essentially makes the effective retirement age less than 60. So as you're getting at the cusp of the most rapid aging, then you also force people who are going to be the majority of your population out of the labor force, that's going to be a disaster. But if we are prepared for it, I think we'll deal with aging.
Okay, other questions? Here, and then here.
Hello, Professor Acemoğlu. Huge fan of your work already, like before you became mainstream. So my question is very simple. I'm thinking about Cambridge Analytica and the research of David Stilwell, right, about the personality profiling and the fact that right now we have a guy like Elon Musk, owner of X, having all the information that we are giving, and we're not even aware of all the information we're giving to ChatGPT and your favorite Chinese one. My question is this in social media or like all these AI tools a new extractive institution? Because in a way, I think that we are putting democracy in danger. And your book is Power and Progress. How can we take back control? That's my question.
100%. I am very worried about exactly what you have articulated. And in fact, I am grateful to Cambridge Analytica because I don't think Cambridge Analytica was doing this very well. And if it wasn't for the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think most people would dismiss these issues. So I think thanks to Cambridge Analytica, they're actually taking it seriously. Because just like I said, J.C.R. Licklider's positive inspirations, they were aspirations, they weren't feasible, but now they are becoming feasible. It's exactly the same thing. With AI, what you said is going to become feasible, and it's a big danger. Now, but the situation is, in my mind, again, perhaps I have a hammer and I see everything as nail, but in my mind it's entirely analogous to what I've just talked about, because AI is not in its nature pro-surveillance. You can use AI as a tool for empowering people. You can give it to people so that they know when they're being monitored. They know when they are being manipulated, when they are being fed wrong information. And you can use AI in order to hide your private information that you don't want to share, and you can share information in exactly the way that you want. But we're not developing it that way. We're not developing it as a way of empowering people and increasing their privacy. We're developing it as a way of surveilling people much more, monitoring their behavior, manipulating them more, and that raises all of the concerns that you have aptly described. But again, we could make different choices there.
There was a question over there.
Thank you, Professor Acemoğlu, for being here. My question is about global shared prosperity. So mostly we talked about workers versus richer class in one country. But what about the, let's say, a country X run by a dictator, and the people get rid of this dictator and improve their institutes? Can they close the gap, or are they at the mercy of the richer countries who have accumulated know-how and capital?
Well, I think it's never easy for emerging countries, but we have examples in the past of countries that have improved their institutions that were able to kickstart economic growth, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Botswana. But I worry exactly for the same reasons about the present. First of all, let's take autocracies. Today they're much more stable. China, which by the way, I don't think China should be viewed as a complete rival to the United States. I think there have to be some cooperation between the United States and China when it comes to AI, as well as climate change. But right now, China's emphasis is a lot on surveillance technologies, and those technologies are not just being developed in China, they're also being exported. Huawei by itself has exported surveillance technologies to more than 60 countries around, all of them autocratic countries. So autocracies are going to become more repressive and stable. But there's another problem. Take a country like India, for example, which, okay, fine, under Narendra Modi, there are ups and downs in democracy, but it's a market economy that's at least has fairly fairly stable electoral institutions. Its economy is very much impacted by AI. What's going on in the global north? Why? Because if we develop AI in a way that just focuses on automation, a lot of things that are done in the Indian economy, for example, all these offshore services, all of the support tasks, etc., they will all be done now by AI. So, in other words, AI's direction will matter not just workers in Switzerland and US and the UK, but it will matter for people in the developing world. And there's a bigger problem there, because we could imagine that the voices of workers in the United States might be heard via a variety of channels. There is absolutely no organizational form that could make the voices, wishes, and the impact on the 6 billion people who live outside of Europe, US, and China to have any voice in the direction of AI.
Okay. There's a question very far behind. 2 questions.
Hi, thank you so much. You discussed a lot about the dangers of big entrepreneurs in tech sector. Recently, many of them are pointing out to some long-termism argument on for the wealth and the sake of humanity. I would be very interested in hearing your opinion about what long-termism is, and if those existential risks in the future somehow can justify what they're doing nowadays, and how do you see it?
Thank you very much. Actually, there are, if I could abuse my power here to set the agenda, there are really 2 questions that are there in your question, and I would like to separate and give them answers. One of them is, suppose we are worried about these threats about AI becoming so super powerful, AGI, and then later super intelligence. Is the way we're approaching it is right? No. No, my answer isn't right. Because the AI safety industry, which has become very powerful and very big, is obsessed with what will happen the day after AI becomes super intelligent. Will they destroy humanity? Well, I would say 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years before AI becomes super intelligent, it's already so powerful that whichever company, whichever individual controls it, they can do unmeasurable damage. So I would worry much more about those 10 years, 1 year before AGI. So that's why I think our current emphasis on AI safety, of designing the algorithm such that it can itself not do harm, is wrong and counterproductive. Second, do I think that we are very near AGI, which I think is also part of your question. And there I think I don't know the answer. A year ago I would have said definitely not, but the last year there's so many industry insiders who are saying it's just around the corner. Okay, I discount that by a couple of years, but it would be irresponsible for me to say I know for sure it won't happen in 10 years. I still cannot imagine these current architecture generating anything human level intelligence, but I think we have to think about various different scenarios. That being said, I think focusing on AGI is actually very counterproductive for another reason. I mentioned China versus US. There is no doubt that China-US relations and rivalry are going to be defining for our next 15, 20 years. If both US and China believe that we are moving very rapidly towards AGI, and whoever controls AGI will control the world, there is no possibility of any possible cooperation between these countries. If, on the other hand, if the reality is, and they believe, that we can use AI for things like I'm talking about, making workers more productive, providing better services, financial services, better online services, better monitoring of health problems, designing better batteries or controlling the time path of energy using AI. All of these things create alignments between the US and China because those are things both countries would benefit from, and there is no reason for not sharing technologies for controlling climate change, for example. So whether we put the emphasis on AGI or the more pro-human uses of AI, I think has fairly major geopolitical implications as well.
So let me abuse my power a little bit and ask a question, because many people were pointing in this direction. So many people asked something along the following lines. Let's assume we go in the direction of automation. Let's assume that we don't go your road down, increasing marginal productivity and not just average productivity, so that basically workers become superfluous. So basically everything is done by machines. Now, an alternative vision could be that you then redistribute politically, basically. This has been behind proposal of a basic conditional or unconditional basic income and so on. So what's wrong with that vision?
So I think that's a great question, and it's an important question we have to engage with. Why don't we just not worry about the labor market, produce as much as we want? Indeed, GDP is the only metric, and then we distribute GDP fairly. I think there are three problems with that, at least two problems that are major and one problem that's very major, but perhaps it's not a real problem, and it's a potential problem. Let me start with the ones that I know are problems. First of all, today, you don't see Elon Musk and Sam Altman rushing to redistribute their wealth. If they become much more powerful, and if their machines are producing everything, what makes you think that they're going to be so supportive of, redistributing the major part of their wealth through universal basic income or some other means so that everybody lives comfortably? So that would be a problem. The political economy of that story doesn't work very well. That's number one.
So is your vision less dependent on some social mobilization and political economy requirements?
No, but it's that social mobilization will not be feasible if all means of information are controlled by a few people. Okay. The second is, even if we manage to do that, that would be a very sad world, because consumption inequality may be low, but social status would be completely unequal. Because everybody would recognize that just a 1%, 2%, 3% of the population is contributing, are the engineers, designers, etc., who are making everything. And the remaining 97% are the takers that are not contributing anything. And that would create a huge social status gap. So that's number two. The third one is, even if we overcame this, I don't know what would create social meaning for people. So that means, would we really be a happy, functional society if 97% of people just stay at home and play video games or live in a virtual world? So I think I'm much more willing to put my money on, we continue to create a society in which we find ways in which people with diverse skills actually contribute to society. And I think it's feasible if we steer technology the right way.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? There's one in the... the next time we have to give it to the person at the very back then, because it was waiting for a long time. But not now, go ahead.
I'll be really short. Don't you think there is a chance that AI will create new jobs, so shared prosperity will be just a question of time?
Absolutely. I think there is a possibility. That's what I was trying to argue, that AI, by providing better information to workers and people, can be a conduit for generating new services, creating new tasks where people perform more sophisticated tasks, new tasks. The run-of-the-mill electricians can now deal with the most complex problems, and we can upgrade all our electricity grid because now people are much more capable of performing these things. We can use AI in order to create new molecules and better drugs that will then employ a lot of people in that process. But I think that will not happen automatically. It is not the business model of most of the companies that are investing in AI. Right now, the main way in which people are trying to monetize AI is via either digital advertising, and that goes into the problem that we just talked about, or by creating automation processes. And again, as a byproduct, perhaps accidentally we'll find ways of augmenting humans, but that's not what we are aiming. And I'm not so confident about the automatic process because we didn't see enough of that in the last 40 years.
Okay, very.
Yeah, my question is actually about knowledge spillover you mentioned. So as an economist, how do you evaluate or measure this knowledge spillover so that we can say, for instance, if there was no investment or these developments in the US, whether we would have seen this new advancement in a country like China?
I think international technological spillovers are absolutely first order, and they have been first order way before the digital age, and they may have become stronger during the digital age, I don't know. And it is true that a lot of the early innovation in China, in AI, was very much building on the US basis. Whether China now has come to a level where it can survive without those spillovers as an innovation hub remains to be seen, but possibly yes, because what DeepSeek shows is that they are not copying, they're also experimenting with new things, but there are also bottlenecks. Chip design and chip manufacturing is not very advanced in China, so there the spillovers are very important. There are other sectors in which those spillovers will have to be important as well.
There's a question here, the first row.
Professor, we are at the university and I would like to ask a question of an unbrave student. If economy were a giant party, would you say the market is DJ, the government is the bouncer, and inequality is the guy who drinks all the punch and starts fights?
That's a good, I like that. I'll have to use that in the next party.
Okay, there are a fair number of economists here in the room, and one of them is asking a question. Just next in here.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have a very simple question. If I understand you properly, you argued mainly from the supply side. And I would like to ask you, how do you introduce the demand side in your argument, particularly for consumption, for development of consumption, for ratio between consumption and savings over the long term, and how does that impact the development you're describing? Thank you.
Yes, you're 100% right. All of my argument has been from the supply side, and that's where my work focuses. I don't doubt that demand side could matter, but that's not what I have researched extensively. The main thing I would pay attention to on the demand side is that a lot of the inequality means that purchasing power is in the hands of a small group of people whose consumption profile is very different than the rest of society. And that's going to impact what new services are developed, where investment goes, where they live is very different. So that will have implications. Whether the shortage of aggregate demand, which is something, for example, Stiglitz argued, will be a first order factor or not, that remains to be seen. I don't think there is, to me, but again, I'm not an expert, there is any evidence that there isn't any evidence that aggregate demand shortage was a major determinant of what we are seeing, certainly not during the last few years. But I think it's a topic to be investigated much more in detail.
Question here, and then over there.
So in light of the upcoming potential automation of the skills we teach at university, what should we teach now, and what should students focus on?
I would say there are 3 points to bear in mind when it comes to teaching. One, a little bit different from your question, which is that I think the education sector is actually a great place to experiment with ways of using AI to enrich what we do. Not to replace teachers, not to do what Khan Academy tries to do, get the teacher out and the student and the parents and the student learn by themselves, but can we use AI to make teachers better in secondary schools, in elementary schools, in other places? So that's number one. Second, obvious, and everybody says that, is you have to teach things that are complementary to AI, not substitutes for AI. So making people learn, accounting in the simplest form is probably not the growth sector, because those are already done by AI tools and they will be done better. Of course, good luck forecasting what are the sectors which are going to be done by AI. So Jeff Hinton, the grandfather of AI, according to some, said nobody should become a radiologist. And Jeff is, as knowledgeable on these things as anybody can get, and not frivolous with his predictions, but that prediction didn't turn out to be right. The number of radiologists has only but increased. Elon Musk, not so serious as Jeff Hinton, said nobody should learn to drive because my company is going to have self-driving cars by 2024. Well, that hasn't transpired. So we don't know that. But then the third thing I would say is that I think it's very important that we also teach social responsibility, about how to be socially responsible with technology. When people become physicists, they have a set of values that often preclude the use of using nuclear physics for making bombs. And when you go into biology, ever since the 1980s, there are a set of values about how to use biological engineering in ways that could be harmful. So I think we also have to teach people a little bit about being aware of their choices with AI. And I don't think there's a unique set of values. Some sort of pluralism is probably what we need in that regard.
So there are so many new, you have already the microphone, so you have the power to speak.
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is on our democratic institution. Somehow it seems that at the moment they don't produce the result where social progress from technology is helping all the people. So what changes have to happen in our democratic institution that we get better results out of that, out of the democratic process? Yeah.
If I only knew. But I can't, however much I would like, I can't blame it all on technology. I think there is a crisis of democracy. Whether it's a minor crisis or a major crisis remains to be seen. And I think it predates digital technologies, or at least the social media uses. But what we can see is that in every industrialized country, people's self-reported support for democracy has declined, and this is sharper among the young. There is also a lot more polarization, a lot less willingness to compromise, especially among young people who I think are the real social media generation. So there are a lot of problems for democracy. But ultimately also, I think democracy has underperformed relative to its promise. Democracy's promise was to deliver shared prosperity, to deliver high-quality public services, and to deliver voice. And in all three of them, the last few decades, democracy could have done better. Inequality has increased in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in many other countries. Public services have become much lower quality, much more bureaucratic, much less effective regulations. And I think a lot of people feel they don't have a voice in the United States. 70 to 80% of people say they have no voice in the political system. And almost 90% people say politicians don't reflect the views of people like me. Again, you could blame social media. I think there is a lot to blame in social media, but it's also a deeper problem, and I think those have to be overcome. So what that means, in short, is that democracy has to be much more successful in delivering what people want, and it has to sort of demonstrate that it is doing so, which both of those are hard. People want very different things. They want difficult things, and then even if you're successful, if in a social media environment the truth never surfaces, it's hard to demonstrate that you're doing it. So it's a difficult thing, but I'm not sure that it spells the end of democracy already, but we are in a danger zone, I would imagine. That's an important problem to tackle.
In your speech, you said Europe fell behind in technology because of too many regulations. Don't you plead for regulations in the field of AI and the danger of its algorithms? I think about young people who are in danger of because of these algorithms. You know, the discussion in Australia and in Ireland about restricting the access to the social media in young people. What do you think about regulations of this sector?
Well,
legal regulations?
I explicitly did not say Europe fell behind because of regulations. I pointed out that in many industries, telecommunications, aerospace, manufacturing, banking, Europe's not behind, even though in some of those it's more regulated. I think Europe fell behind in the tech sector for a variety of reasons, and regulation could be a contributing factor. But I would agree that regulation has become very inefficient in a number of countries in Europe and in the United States. Actually, the United States possibly is worse than Europe. So if you look at data, there are some recent studies that show that construction, highway building, all sorts of things like that have become about 3 to 4 times more expensive in the last 30 years. And almost all of it is the amount of red tape you have to go through. So it is undoubtedly true that we need regulations for safety, but we have turned regulation into a social engineering tool in the United States, and perhaps to some extent in Europe, and that is completely counterproductive. So we need to have effective, efficient, and lighter touch regulation. And that's very, very important because exactly like what you said, I think we need regulation in social media. Social media has become the major source of news for a generation. So it's playing the same role that newspapers, respectable newspapers and other newspapers were playing. If you look at newspapers around the Western world, and in fact beyond the Western world, they were to some degree self-regulated, to some degree regulated via outside institutions to be fair, stick to facts and be balanced, and all sorts of other things that, for example, are captured by the Hutchins report in the United States, which shaped the direction of the US journalism, but it's very similar values are very important in Europe. There's nothing like that in social media. So we need to have some system, but it cannot be very draconian. I think if it's draconian and you say, you cannot use that word or you cannot use this word on social media, it's not going to work and it's going to create more backlash. I think it has to be at the level of what you allow and how you monitor the monetization of information via algorithms. So I think that's the space in which we have to think about regulations.
So there is a question here.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Mr. Acemoğlu, thank you very much for this illuminating lecture. I enjoyed every second of it. Still, because I have the great privilege of having the ear of a leader, such as yourself, I would like to counter what you said about a vision of the future where we work less and tax companies. You mentioned the following 3 problems. Firstly, Sam Altman isn't rushing to redistribute his wealth. I think we could make him. Secondly, a problem is that social status would go to engineers, leaving everyone else with depreciated social status. I think social status is something we seek to figure out intrinsically. I think we would find new pointers to assign social status broadly. And finally, what creates social meaning? I think work certainly gives meaning to all people. But maybe it is hardest for workaholics who lead society to imagine a world without work. I think I would find meaning in literature, Chinese landscape paintings, and learning 10 languages. I'm at 4, I would like to get to 6 by the end of next year, but we'll see. With all the politicians and decision makers gathered here, I hope we do not completely discard this vision of a shared future.
Thank you. We respectfully disagree.
So let me ask a final question, which is related to your publication record. There are a few academic economists here in the room, and actually this question got a lot of support in the votings. I read, your publication record is truly remarkable, both in terms of quality and volume. What strategies or habits have helped you maintain such a high level of productivity in your research and writing? So some self-help for people in the room.
Well, one part may be that I'm a workaholic, as the previous question suggested. But I think the more practical advice I would say is find great co-authors. I have some of them here. Fabrizio is there, Fabrizio Zilibotti, and David Hemus is somewhere there. So, and some great students too. I see Michael Peters. So I think having great collaborators is a very important part of both making work socially meaningful and also productive.
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation and for your discussion. Let's applaud Daron. You see how popular you are already. Wow. Now I want to make a few announcements before you leave. First of all, I want to draw your attention to an event that we have on April 3 on the following topic. I read the Swiss title, or the German Swiss title is Warum ist die Schweiz so reich und weshalb es nicht so bleiben muss? We will have interesting discussions on this. One Bundesrat, Albert Rösti, is coming. Several other good speakers are coming from industry, from politics. It will be a very interesting discussion. And I hope to welcome you all at our future events. Please note that you can see everything on the internet also. This has been recorded. We have also many other good videos. Look at them and enjoy the evening. Thank you for coming. Great.
Thank you,